Some people work with snakes. Some people collect snakes. Some have snakes for pets. But most of us are afraid of snakes. It's a normal reaction. Many snakes are dangerous. But there are other people whose fear of snakes is abnormal. This patient is one. His fear was so intense, he went to a psychologist for help. His treatment was filmed. Here, in an actual therapy session with the psychologist, he describes how his phobic fear of snakes began.
So I left the South, and I was about 16. I moved to California. And people said, well, there are no snakes in California, but I found out that wasn't true. I was, working in the yard one day, and there was this little snake in the grass, and I didn't work in the yard anymore. That's, just like right now, just talking about them, it gets on my nerves, kind of.
Well, that's a good point. Now, just talking about them, now you feel a little tense inside, a little tight.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it seems like by talking about them, I can conjure them up.
This is more than normal fear. We call it a phobia. A fear so unreasonable, it interferes with normal living. A fear so deep that even the thought of a snake sets up a physical fear reaction.
Yeah, I walked down to the youth center, and there was a friend of mine there, just casually, walking up, and, I like to kid around a lot, I'm always talking about stuff. And I walked down, and we were talking, and for about 5 minutes, just talking to her, and she said, "Hey, Ralph, did you see that snake there?" I said, "What snake?" And I left. I just had to split, because, it just seemed like, the thing that really got me is that he was there all the time, and I didn't know it. And that's the thing about him, you don't know when they're around. Like it's something else that's in a cage.
Now, the time when she said there was a snake, do you remember how you felt at that time?
I just got flushed. Yeah, my whole body sensation, like I got warm all over, and I just left.
Okay, that's what we want to work on. That's what relaxation will do. It will alleviate that kind of a feeling.
The fear is actual and physical. The man is mature, intelligent, educated. Yet a phobia is eating away at his normal life and his relations with his family. He is not alone. Countless numbers of otherwise normal people suffer from exaggerated fears. Fears of heights, of crowds, even of peanut butter. Psychologists know that these phobias were learned, not consciously learned, but branded on the consciousness through a learning process called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning begins with natural or innate reflexes. This baby drools automatically when he eats. We call this an innate reflex. Blinking is also an innate reflex. In this experiment, the subject blinks automatically every time a puff of air strikes her eye. Another reflex is the knee jerk. In the early 1900s, an American psychologist, E.B. Twitmeyer, was studying this knee jerk reflex, tapping his patients on the knee with a hammer. Twitmeyer decided to give a warning signal before dropping the hammer. After he had done it time after time, he found that patients' knees jerked when the warning signal sounded, even before the hammer tap. Twitmeyer realized that if a signal, such as the light being used in this recreation, were paired repeatedly with the tap, the patient would eventually respond to the light alone, In 1904, he presented these findings to the American Psychological Association. Unfortunately, Twitmeyer's colleagues were not interested. But half a world away, a Russian physiologist working in St. Petersburg was developing similar ideas which would lead to the theory of classical conditioning. In 1904, Ivan Pavlov received the Nobel Prize in Physiology for studies of the digestive systems of dogs. Studying the digestive system led to a study of salivation, an innate reflex like the knee jerk. Dogs salivate automatically at the sight of food. But Pavlov found that sometimes his dogs salivated before they were given food. He was determined to find out the cause. He set up an experiment with a device that diverted saliva from inside the dog's mouth so that the saliva could be seen and measured. With food as the unconditioned stimulus, saliva would be the unconditioned response. The next step was to associate or pair the unconditioned stimulus, the food, with a neutral stimulus, in this case, a metronome. The ideal length of time between the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, the food, and the neutral stimulus, the metronome, was about 1/2 second. After several repetitions, the dog began to associate the sound of the metronome with the food. The metronome had become a conditioned stimulus. The dog's salivation from hearing the metronome had become a conditioned response. So, to clarify the elements of classical conditioning, it consists of the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, which produces an unconditioned response, or UCR. When the unconditioned stimulus is paired with a conditioned stimulus, or CS, the result is a conditioned response, or CR. When Pavlov presented his findings, his colleagues saw great possibilities in the uses of conditioning. Russia at that time was a superstitious, backward country. Peasants were poor, uneducated, and restless. The country teetered on the brink of chaos. The rich and the rulers were autocratic. So were most European rulers of that era. But in Russia, the gap between rich and poor, rulers and ruled, seemed greater. As the 20th century dawned, there were rumors of revolution. Peasants really loved Mother Russia. Visitors found the country elegant and charming, if a little quaint. But most of the working people were hungry. They saw the aristocrats as irresponsible men and women living in a world that was dying. When the communists came to power in 1917, they encouraged Pavlov's work. If human behavior consisted of automatic responses similar to those of animals, conditioning offered a means of controlling the thoughts of millions of people. People were machines, waiting to be manipulated in the newborn union of Soviet Socialist republics. The United States wasn't interested in mass political indoctrination. We found other uses for classical conditioning. Among them, advertising. Mass advertising, a uniquely American application of classical conditioning, was developed by J.B. Watson, a famous psychologist in the 1920s. Watson recognized that there are numerous stimuli in our environment to which we react automatically. It seemed reasonable to assume that if we were given the right pairings of stimuli, for example, a symbol with a positive image, and a product which was then identified with that symbol, we would probably purchase that product. Case in point. What does the winged figure of Mercury have to do with a florist delivery service? Well, Mercury is a Roman god, which makes him a rather elegant messenger boy. And he's supernaturally fast. Florists displaying the Mercury symbol want us to think that their service will be elegant and swift, and that the symbol will trigger that thought. A conditioned response is stronger when symbols represent strong emotions, like patriotism, or the mixed emotions felt on New Year's Eve. Many of today's movies are prime examples of conditioned stimuli evoking conditioned responses. Take a scene such as this, with music, and you'll probably get a response. Even basic needs, such as hunger, can become classically conditioned responses. Many of us eat because it's mealtime by the clock, not necessarily because we're hungry. If you've ever dieted, you probably had to break the bond between conditioned stimulus, time of day, and response, eating. Pavlov realized that the bond between stimulus and response could be broken. He retrained his dogs not to salivate when they heard the metronome, the conditioned stimulus. He removed the food, the unconditioned stimulus, letting the dog listen to the metronome as usual. The dog begins to salivate, but this time there's no food. When this is repeated again and again, salivation, the conditioned response, disappears. It has been extinguished. Extinction is one way of breaking the conditioned stimulus-response bond. Another is counter-conditioning, which substitutes a new response in place of an old one. Both can be used in treatment for fears and phobias. One such treatment is called desensitization. Here we see desensitization therapy being used to help a patient overcome his fear of dental syringes. The therapist helps the boy relax and deal with his fears from the least to the greatest. The sight and touch of the syringe. He examines the syringe closely. The syringe with no tip. The syringe touches his lip. The boy touches the blunt tip and lets the tip rest on his lip. This ordering of fears is known as the hierarchy of fears. Though some desensitization takes longer, the procedure is always to deal with the fears from least to greatest. A fear of snakes may require a longer period of desensitization, but again, the therapy starts with relaxation.
Picking up a pamphlet with a snake on it. Oh, feels so good. Really relaxed. As you walk out, you open up the pamphlet, and there's 4 or 5 colored pictures of different kind of snakes. Big, medium, small. Who cares? Just so relaxed.
By replacing the conditioned response, tension, with conscious relaxation, the patient begins dealing with his hierarchy of fears. His least terrifying fear is thinking about snakes, so the therapist asks him to imagine one.
As you walk up the trail, you look up the trail, making sure that everything is clear. But you see a stick laying in the trail, or at least it looks like a stick, you're not sure. As you kind of get closer to it, still there, you're not really too concerned because you just feel so good and nothing could happen today. Nothing. As you walk up the trail, you think maybe it might be a little snake. But what you do is stop and wait to make sure. You're about 100 feet from it. It's too little to bother you. And so you walk up a little closer. You get about 50 feet away from it. 50 feet away from it. And the little snake crawls in the bushes.
Having overcome this fear, the patient is ready to advance to a more fear-inducing step in his hierarchy, looking at pictures of snakes.
That's good. Because, just the sight of the fangs,
And that's something that bothered you before?
Oh, yeah. And all of a sudden, you're thumbing to a book, and all of a sudden, there's this enlargement of a rattlesnake's head with venom coming from the fangs.
Yeah.
Again, he is successful. After 8 sessions, the patient has worked his way to the top of his hierarchy of fears. He confronts a live snake. And thanks to desensitization therapy, he is no longer terrified.
I never thought till Dad, be able to sit up and let one be that close to me, even though I wasn't holding it. It was a little aggressive.
Well, it's a little kind of warm for him. You think you'd like to touch him?
Yeah. You hold the head, and I'll touch the tail.
Okay, at your convenience.
Hey, he's not slimy.
No, they aren't slimy.
Man, that's something I never did like. I don't like,
Oh, see, he's got his tail suspended up in there, see when he puts it down.
What kind of snake is this?
I really don't know. I don't know that too much about snakes. I've always liked them. They've been very, very nice little pets.
Yeah, he's really beautiful. He really is.
A patient with a phobia is unable to discriminate. Fear of snakes, for example, might also become fear of shoelaces or any other reminder of snakes. This type of response is known as generalization. But when a patient undergoes discrimination training during therapy, he learns to respond to each stimulus realistically. A shoestring is no longer fearful. Not all phobias are as extreme as this generalized fear of snakes, but some can be just as terrifying. Aerophobia, fear of airplanes. Many of us have it. Most of us fly anyway, hoping the worst won't happen. But what about those people for whom a Dramamine tablet, a drink or two, or a hurried prayer are not enough to block out the overwhelming fear of disaster? Desensitization can be the answer. This woman has aerophobia. Now she's about to take her first plane ride.
Well, Mrs. Boyd, this is the big day now. It's your solo flight. Do you have any anxiety whatsoever?
Well, I feel very anxious, but reassuring anyway.
Good. Well, I just consider that really normal apprehension.
The therapist helped this woman identify her hierarchy of fears and to face each fear one by one. She learned to associate flying with relaxing experiences, from simply looking at airplane pictures to lunching at the airport. It's taken a long time, but today she's willing to fly. She's a little apprehensive, much as you or I might be, but she's on her way. All of us have fears. Some of them take the form of nightmares. Others, such as fear of heights, are shared by everyone. We may not be aware of why we are afraid, but with desensitization therapy, we can overcome these anxieties. Step 1. Identify the least fear-producing situation. Diving off the low board, feet first. Progress to a more fear-producing level. Diving off the high board, feet first. Finally, tackle the most fearful situation. Diving off the high board, head first. Normal amounts of fear protect us in dangerous situations. Without healthy fear, we might get hurt. Counter-conditioning is like walking on a narrow beam, a kind of balancing act for our behavior, a way of replacing extreme responses with a more even approach. Maintaining a balanced diet is what people with weight problems are trying to do when they go for professional help.
You know, last week we were talking about some of the changes that we had to make in our lives, and that in order for us to have permanent weight loss, we had to make permanent changes, that we really had to look at some of the situations of our lives and ask ourselves, what can I do in this situation to ensure myself to be thin?
In some cases, you can't. The extinguished response, overeating, might reappear. This dog hasn't completely forgotten his response to the metronome. When he hears the tone several weeks after extinction training, he again salivates, even if there isn't any food, as though he were still conditioned. It can happen. That's why the repetition of therapy in weekly group sessions such as these is important for changing our long-term behavior. But not all types of conditioned behavior should be changed. We never think about our response to traffic signals. Particularly to the color red. Roadside advertisers make good use of our conditioned response to stop at red. From steering a safe path through traffic to overcoming a fear of heights, we use the principles of classical conditioning every day of our lives. Those principles of classical conditioning are very basic. An unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response. When an unconditioned stimulus is paired with a conditioned stimulus, the result is a conditioned response. These simple principles of learning revolutionized the field of psychology. Now, neither Twitmeyer nor Pavlov guessed what would follow from their discovery that man's behavior could be changed. Useful tools like desensitization therapy and potentially dangerous tools like the one bombarding you with thousands of stimuli, month after month, night and day, suggesting, subtly influencing, this very second, it's got you. What is it? You're right, it's television. Use it with care.